Hello, welcome to The Ticket. I'm Tracey Holmes. He's been a player, a captain, a coach, a selector and a board member. He's one of three cricketing brothers to have played for Australia, two of them rising to captain the men's national team, as their grandfather once did back in the 1930s. He is familiar with the highs, the lows, the controversies and the politics of a sport that still dominates Australian summers. Greg Chappell, welcome to the program.
Hi Tracey, thank you very much.
Now, since 1876, Australia's men's national team has had only 47 captains. Your grandfather, Vic, was number 20, just before the legendary Don Bradman. Your brother, Ian, was number 34, and you were next at 35. Why is the position so highly regarded in Australian sporting circles?
Look, I think it's because of the way that the game is regarded in the country. As you said, it dominates the summer, and it has done through all those years. And, it's become a very important part of the Australian summer scene. So anyone that's been fortunate enough to hold that position has known very well of the responsibility and the regard in which that role is held.
And it doesn't come without controversy, does it, Greg? We've seen in 2018 there was Sandpaper Gate. Most recently for Tim Payne, we've seen the sexting saga. And of course, for you back in 1981, there was the underarm bowling incident. Can you just talk us through the mind of a skipper? What happens to that? What sort of pressure there is? And is this all a factor in the kind of win at all costs attitude that might have been around?
Yeah, look, the job comes with a lot of responsibility, obviously, and with that responsibility there are a lot of decisions that have to be taken, and sometimes we get it wrong in the pressure of the moment, and often at the latter end of a season, the workload off the field, as much as anything else, builds up during a season. And even though there's a lot more support for the Australian captain off the field these days, and the players tend to share the media workload around, there's still a lot of responsibility for the captain. And I think each one of us has probably had a few decisions that if we had the opportunity, we'd take them back and do something a little bit differently. I don't think the attitude of winning at all costs, and I don't think that attitude has been around. Maybe a few moments, but not over the long term. I don't think. I think Australian teams, by and large, have played the game in the spirit that it's been intended. We play hard and we try and win. There's no doubt that that's our primary goal every time we start a test match, a one-day game or a T20 match. But I think playing for a win at all costs can get you into trouble.
You speak in your most recent book, Greg Chappell, Not Out. You cover everything in quite fine detail, but one of the things you talk about quite specifically is this idea that captains become spent over a period of time. You felt that, but you say you can also recognise it in others. Can you give us more detail on that? How do you recognise it, and what is the impact of that?
Oh, look, I think at the end of a long season, I didn't realise when I was playing just how tired I was sometimes. Obviously the adrenaline is flowing and you seem to get through. And it's only at the end of a season that you realise how tired you are when the body says, OK, now you can stop for a while, you're going to lie down and have a rest. And it used to take me, 4-6 weeks after the end of a season to really feel that I was back to normal again. I remember walking into the players' area in Perth a few years back, the end of the Ashes series in 2017, and Steve Smith was sitting on one of the physiotherapist benches just staring into space, and you could just see by the look on his face that there was a man that had pretty much used up every ounce of energy that he had. And when I spoke to him, he admitted that he was pretty much shot. He'd used up every ounce of energy, and that was just prior to the tour of South Africa. So you can understand that things can go wrong when leaders are in that state. So it's something that I felt very strongly about when I finished playing and spent some time on the cricket board, that we had to make sure that we provided as much support for the captains as we could, because there aren't that many. As you said before, Pat Cummins has become the 45th or 47th captain of Australia. So there aren't that many that have done it over the journey, and there aren't that many that are perhaps capable of doing it. So when you get somebody who can do it and can do a good job of it, you really need to give them the support to make sure that they can do it for as long as possible.
You've spoken of some of those positions that you've held and pretty much every layer of the game, not just here in Australia, but you've also gone on and coached in India and been involved in other parts of the world. But you do talk of being able to make some of the most far-sighted and rewarding decisions in a game that quite possibly would not be made today, because today is so much faster paced, the faster news cycle, and you speak of instant gratification. Is there a problem with the way professional sport is played today that doesn't enable those same sorts of far-sighted decisions to be made?
Well, there's a lot more cricket being played. Obviously, now there are 3 formats. You've got the IPL as well that squeezes in between whatever international commitments the top players have. So they're on the go constantly, and there isn't a lot of time to have a break and get away from the game. The demands not only of the main media outlets but of social media, and the social media cycle, if you like, is even faster than the daily cycle for mainstream media. So there is a lot more pressure on players and decision making. I think we probably had a little bit more space and a little bit more time to gather our thoughts and consider things more fully. That's not the case today, and it's nobody's fault. It's just the way that things have worked out. But I think that leads to extra pressure and the likelihood of extra problems that come from that. So again, it's incumbent of the sporting bodies to make sure that those who are in responsible positions are given as much support as they can possibly be given.
We'll talk more about the management side of the sport a little bit later, but I want to tap into your experiences in India, coaching a different national team, and I guess the cultural aspects at play, because even though the world is playing the same game by the same rules, there is really a cultural element that comes into the style of play, the way the teams are picked, and the mentality that is taken out onto the field, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. It was very different in India than in Australia for the cultural reasons. A lot more players, a lot more people involved in the game, a lot more people involved in decision making. I found out that there were many layers of selection, for instance, in India. Not only the selectors, but you had the people who selected the selectors and the people who selected the people who selected the selectors, all felt that they had a right to have a say in selection. It was much more difficult picking teams in India than it is in Australia, where you have a selection panel that is well and truly identified and is left alone to pretty much do the job. And so therefore, and the other aspect of it, of course, is that in India there are more players, and therefore pressure to change players because there are just that many more who are performing at any given time. I think in Australia it's a little bit easier in some ways, that we have less players to pick from, and therefore you tend to focus on the best players that you've got and work with that group. So it was a very different scenario in India, and I had to work within that scenario. I wasn't a selector, but as coach, obviously the selectors spoke with me, as they did with the captain, around selections. The zonal system in India, there are 5 main zones in India, therefore they had 5 selectors. We tend to have 3, maximum 4 in Australia. So the bigger the panel gets, the more opinions that you've got. The selection meetings tended to take a little bit longer in India because you had the politics at play, selectors from each zone, so they were always jockeying for their players to get picked in the team. So just a little bit different, a little bit more complicated, but I think by and large, at the end of the day, the selectors got things right more often than not.
Well, you would say that, wouldn't you, as a selector, Greg? I want to talk about being a selector because you can never get it right, can you? We know from our conversations at home, at work, in the pub, the selectors always get it wrong. What are those conversations like between selectors, and why is there this idea that you can never get it right?
Yeah, well, I think the thing that you learn as a selector, and I'm talking about selecting in Australia at this stage, is that there are at least 1 million other selectors around the country who think, you know, they are as entitled as you are to have a say in selection, and they are. But at the end of the day, the actual selectors are the ones that have to make the decisions. They're the ones that are closer to the action and closer to what's going on. They have more information available to them about players, their strengths, their weaknesses, their personalities, you know, which conditions are more likely to suit the players and so on. So, you know, I think it's much harder for the lounge room selector to get it right because they don't have all of the information. But as I said before, you know, I think by and large the selectors get it right more often than they get it wrong. One thing that I do know is that, you know, 9 players in most 11s pick themselves. You know, certainly 7 or 8 pick themselves. It's the last 1 or 2 places that take up most of the conversation. And I've got to say, from my experience over you know, 2 or 3 iterations as a selector, we've been very fortunate, the quality of people that we've had on the selection panels. We've been very fortunate about the quality of the chairman. You know, the 3 chairmen that I worked with, Laurie Saul, Andrew Sincock and Trevor Hones, were all quality individuals and did tremendous work for Australian cricket over the journey. We had some robust discussions in selection meetings, and everybody got the opportunity to have their say. And you know, we would talk about, we didn't always agree, obviously, but you would get the chance to discuss your thoughts about a particular player, for instance, and the others got their chance, and at the end of the session we would agree that this was the right choice, and we would walk out of the room with a feeling that it was a unanimous decision. And I think that's been the great strength of selecting in Australian cricket.
And how much involvement is there, or how much consideration is given to how those team members are going to come together and fit together psychologically? Because I know you've done a lot of work with psychology and experts from around the world. How important is it to get that mix right, and not just the physical mix of what you need for the game?
Yeah, it's always a consideration. There's a lot that goes into getting the right blend. You know, you know that batting obviously takes place in partnerships, but even bowling takes place in partnerships. And you know, if you've got someone bowling well at one end, you need someone who's going to blend in with them at the other end. You don't want someone like a Glenn McGrath who's going to tie things up pretty tightly at one end, and then someone who's going to be profligate at the other end and just leak runs madly. So they're important considerations. You know, who bats with whom. Right hand and left hand combinations are an obvious example, but it's not always just that. You know, you can look at Langer and Hayden as a great opening pair for Australia, and they were both left-handers, but they had very different styles of play, and that combination could actually work well, and worked well in confusing the opposition. You know, Hayden was a bigger, taller individual who tended to be aggressive and hit the ball down the ground, whereas Langer was smaller, tended to hit the ball square of the wicket. The right length for each of them was quite different, and if the bowlers didn't adjust quickly between one and the other, they could be punished by the other player, as right and left-handers can create the same problems. The personalities of the players, you know, batting together is really important. You know, we've got David Warner, who's an aggressive opening batsman, so you don't necessarily need someone at the other end who is going to be as aggressive and maybe take some of the batting away from David Warner. You want David to be, if he's in form particularly, playing as many balls as possible, because you know that he's going to score at 60 runs, 100 balls. That's going to set an innings up for you. So you don't want 2 players batting like David Warner together, and therefore Harris is a good combination with Warner. Equally, you don't want 2 less aggressive batsmen, two very similar players batting together who are just going to soak up a lot of deliveries. So all of that comes into play. Which players enjoy batting together. Smith and Labuschagne really bat well together. They're not dissimilar in personality, but they're both smart enough to recognise that if the other one's going well, they are quite happy to take on the support role, and vice versa. So there's all of those considerations that go into picking teams. And then, of course, fielding comes into that as well. If you've got two players who are pretty equal as far as batting or bowling ability, if one fields better than the other, then that's going to be taken into consideration.
And so with all of that parked to one side, what is it like then playing as part of three brothers, Ian, Greg and Trevor? What is it like when you've got the pressure of the game itself, you've got trying to win and outplay your opponents, but you've also got this sibling rivalry, haven't you? How did that all work?
Yeah, sometimes it worked well, sometimes it didn't work so well. I know in the early stages of playing together, Ian and I struggled a bit with our understanding of batting together, because there's a 5-year age gap. So Ian's 5 years older, so we grew up separately in the early stages, and then I was old enough to participate in the backyard test matches. But we didn't play any cricket together as juniors, because Trevor's 4 and a bit years younger than me, so again there was that separation. We didn't play any cricket together until we were adults. And as I said, Ian and I struggled a bit when we first batted together, and as Ian commented one day when asked about it, he said, look, I'm used to looking down the other end and seeing Greg as an opponent. I'm not used to actually seeing him as being part of the same team. So it took us a little bit of a while to get used to it, but then once we got used to it, there was no problem. In fact, we combined really well. We didn't have to have a lot of spoken communication, because we understood each other's personality and we understood the body language from the other person. I mean, we could bat together for days, as we did on occasions, and hardly speak to each other the whole time we're out there, because we didn't need to. We knew where we were each at, we knew where the game was at, and we managed to combine really well. I didn't play a lot of cricket other than in World Series cricket with Trevor, but again, once we got used to each other, it wasn't a problem. It might have been a problem occasionally when Ian was captain and I was a bowler, because there were times when I didn't agree with his decisions to take me off or not put me on, but I generally got put back in my place pretty quickly.
So you knew the hierarchy of things and the way they should operate. What about now, in later years, when the three of you get together, what are your discussions like, and how much reminiscing is there?
There's a little bit of reminiscing. There's always there's a few stories that come up from time to time. Cricket's obviously front and centre in many of the discussions, particularly when Ian's around, because he loves his cricket. He works still in cricket, so he's got stories around the current day as well as the past days. But thankfully, the 5-year age gap, and almost 5-year age gap with Trevor, was a problem when we were younger, because we didn't spend a lot of time together in those years. But as we've become adults and as we've got older, that age gap disappears almost completely, and we get on really well. We live in different parts of the country, but we speak regularly, and we've got a very good relationship, thankfully, and that's something that all three of us are very proud of.
And I know you get together quite a bit with the work that you do with the Chappell Foundation in raising funds for youth homelessness around Australia. How important has that element also been in the Chappell brothers' lives? Because you seem to have had an upbringing that might have been slightly different. You think slightly differently. You say yourself sometimes you're too left field for some other people. You refer to your mother and father not by mum and dad, but by their first names. And of course, you've got that great tradition with the history of your grandfather also being an Australian captain, but a legendary athlete across a multitude of sports. Would you say your upbringing was terribly different to many other Australians?
Oh, yeah, I would think so. I mean, our father was obviously a very keen sportsman. Mum, through her father, Vic Richardson, grew up in a sporting environment. So from an early age. I mean, from as long as I can remember, there have been cricket balls and cricket bats, baseballs and baseball bats, footballs, table tennis, snooker, basketball, you name it. We've always had that around us. From a cricket point of view, our father was a great observer of the game. He was our initial coach in each case. I think basically he was my one and only coach from that point of view. Very good observer of the game. We got a grounding in cricket that very few people would ever have had, and I think that's probably why the three of us got to play for Australia, because of that early grounding. My father taught me to catch at 2 years of age, and he was quite innovative in his coaching techniques. He learnt very quickly that if he stood in front of me and threw the ball to me, I would look at him rather than the ball. So he stood off to the side and threw the ball against the wall and taught me to catch that way. So that was one example. The other thing he taught me from a very early age was that I had a bat in my hand for one reason and one reason alone, and that was to score runs. He insisted we play with a hard ball from an early age, so we got to understand about the hard ball, but he didn't give us any pads and gloves to play with. And the method behind that madness was that we got hit occasionally, but we soon learnt that if we used the bat properly, we didn't need pads and gloves. So that was an important lesson. And I think the other thing that he was very smart with was that he told us what he wanted us to do rather than how to do it. And he let us work out the best way for us to solve the problem. And I think that was a big part of our early learning in the backyard, was that we were actually making decisions in real time. And in our mind, those test matches in the backyard were real test matches. So that decision making was developed from an early age. And I think the one thing that I've learned over the years is that the best players are the best decision makers. So that was such an important part of our early development.
Greg, in the few short minutes that we have left, I'm not going to ask questions, but I'm going to throw you a series of names, and I'd just like to get your responses to those names. The first one is Sir Donald Bradman.
Sir Donald Bradman was a big part of our life early on. Obviously, our grandfather played cricket with Sir Donald Bradman and against him in club cricket. Our father played cricket with and against Sir Donald Bradman in club cricket, so we were aware of him from a very early age. He had an important role to play in our lives, particularly Ian and I, because he was a national selector and a state selector when we first started playing for South Australia and Australia. We got to see him a lot around the dressing room. He would come in most mornings before a day's play, and I was on the receiving end of a very good piece of advice from him as a teenager about changing my grip, which had a very positive impact on my game.
Richie Benaud.
Richie Benaud is another cricket personality who was a big part of all of our lives. He was one of my heroes growing up as captain of New South Wales and captain of Australia in that 1960s era. Most of my Australian cricket heroes of that time were New South Wales players. Richie Benaud, Neil Harvey, Alan Davidson, Norm O'Neill were the sort of players that I grew up idolising, again through our father. Whenever a visiting team came to South Australia and we were going to the cricket, he would tell us which of the visiting players were the ones that we should watch, and so we'd follow them around. I certainly would. Neil Harvey was probably the favourite of the time, even though he was left-handed. I learned a lot from watching him, not only bat, but watching him in the field as well.
Ian and Trevor.
Ian's my hero. He was my hero from an early age, being the older brother. I always wanted to do what Ian was doing. I wanted to be where he was. Sadly, with that 5-year age gap, he wasn't very interested for a few years in having me around because I was too young to be involved with his peer group. Luckily, he ran out of friends one day and he invited me to play in the test matches in the backyard. And sadly for me, I made my test debut playing for England because our test matches were always Ashes test matches, and Ian, as the older brother, was always Australia. But the good news was that he moved on and I became Australia, and Trevor had to become England. So, you know, we had sort of separate, I had two separate childhoods, if you like. The years where I was looking up to my older brother, and then eventually he left and I became the older brother to Trevor. And I'm not sure that I nurtured Trevor anywhere near as well as I should have done. The backyard test matches, even between Ian and I, were always very, very competitive. But you know, I was so fortunate to have Ian in the next bedroom, because I grew up dreaming of playing Test cricket for Australia. And there in the other room, 5 years older than me, was someone who was putting the footmarks in the sand that showed me the way to go. And the two big milestones in my life were when I was 13, Ian was selected to play for South Australia. And then when I was 16, he was chosen to play a Test match for Australia. And that really brought home to me that if he could do it, maybe I could do it. And I had the footsteps to follow. I learned a few things not to do. Ian and our father Martin used to clash a little bit. If Ian had a late night and was playing cricket or baseball the next day, invariably our father Martin would meet him at the front door and they would argue for an hour or two about who was right and who was wrong. It didn't teach me to come home any earlier, but it taught me not to argue with him when I got there and just go to bed and get an extra hour's sleep. So I learned a lot of lessons, some of them even more important than that one. But yeah, look, I love both my brothers. We're all slightly different, but as Ian has said on many occasions to me, Greg, you and I are much closer in personality than you care to admit, and that's probably true.
And Greg, I'll finish on this. One last name, Judy.
Yeah, Judy's been the best partnership of my life. We met as youngsters. Judy grew up in Sydney and I grew up in Adelaide, but funnily enough, I met Judy's younger sister first through cricket, and then got to know Judy. And you know, we've just passed 50 years of married life. We've known each other for 53 years. She's taught me more than anyone else has taught me. I think she's softened me a lot in many ways, perhaps not in as many ways as she would have liked, but you know, the education that I've received through spending time with her has been really important to me. It's you know, my greatest achievement, I think, is to have survived with her for 50 years, and the three children that we brought up together are our, you know, great crowning glory, and we enjoy not only time with them but with their children. And it's such, you know, it's been such an important part of my life.
Australian cricket legend Greg Chappell, thanks so much for your time today. I'm Tracey Holmes. Thanks for watching. See you next time.